The sun had barely risen when he arrived at the academy gates, carrying nothing but an old leather bag and a folder of worn-out music sheets. The building looked enormous compared to anything he had ever seen before. Its glass doors reflected the morning light, and students dressed in crisp suits and shining shoes hurried inside. He stood there for a moment, feeling small and out of place, his heart beating faster with every passing second. He had dreamed about this day for years. It was the day of the National Music Audition, the day when hundreds of young musicians from all over the country would come to perform in front of a panel of directors and professors. For him, it was not just another performance. It was a chance to change his life. His fingers were rough from working odd jobs, not from hours of formal practice like most of the others here. He didn't have a private tutor or a grand piano at home. His instrument had always been an old upright piano placed in the back corner of the cafe where he worked at night. When the cafe closed and the lights went off, he would sit at that piano, playing softly into the quiet hours until his eyes grew heavy. It was the only time he felt free. As he stepped into the grand hall, his shoes squeaked slightly on the polished floor. The air was filled with the sound of laughter, chatter, and snippets of classical music echoing from practice rooms nearby. Everyone seemed confident, chatting about music theory, famous composers, and their years of training abroad. He kept his head down and walked toward the registration desk, trying not to attract attention. When he handed over his form, the woman behind the desk gave him a quick, polite smile but hesitated when she saw the creased papers and smudged handwriting. She stamped his card and pointed him toward the waiting area. "Audition room C," she said softly. He nodded and thanked her, even though she had already turned to the next person. The waiting area was filled with contestants, some tuning violins, others adjusting sheet stands. He found an empty chair in the corner and sat quietly, holding his folder close to his chest. His old jacket looked completely out of place among the elegant clothes and expensive perfumes. He could feel eyes glancing at him, curious and amused. A group of 3 students sitting nearby began whispering. One of them laughed and said loud enough for him to hear, "Looks like someone brought their village music to the big city." Another smirked and said, "Maybe he's lost." They laughed again, not even trying to hide it. He looked down, pretending not to hear, but inside a familiar ache started to grow. He had faced mockery before, but it never got easier. He took a deep breath and tried to focus on the sheet in his hands. It was a piece he had written himself, inspired by the rhythm of the cafe's clinking cups and quiet nights. He had worked on it for months, shaping every note with patience and hope. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. Every note carried a part of his story. Time passed slowly. Contestant after contestant went inside the audition room and came out, some smiling, others near tears. The sounds of their performances echoed faintly through the closed door. Each time the door opened, his heart skipped a beat. He could hear snippets of fast, perfect scales and graceful melodies that made him doubt himself even more. Finally, his name was called. The sound of it made his stomach twist. He stood up slowly, gripping his folder tightly. The room seemed to fall quieter for a moment as he walked toward the door. He could feel the stares, the quiet snickers, the whispers behind his back. One of the students muttered, "Let's see what the country boy can do." He paused at the door for a second, closed his eyes and remembered his mother's voice, soft but firm, saying, "If you ever feel scared, let your heart speak louder than your fear." He took one more deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, the audition hall looked even larger than he had imagined. A grand piano sat in the center of the stage under bright lights. The panel of judges sat at a long table in front, their faces expressionless. Among them was the director, a tall man with sharp eyes who had discovered many famous musicians. His presence alone was enough to make anyone nervous. The young man walked to the piano, his footsteps echoing across the floor. He bowed slightly as he had practiced and placed his sheet music on the stand. His hands trembled a little as he adjusted the bench and sat down. He could hear a few quiet whispers from the back of the hall, other contestants waiting for their turn. Someone coughed softly, another chuckled. The sound of laughter seemed to linger in the air, faint but sharp enough to sting. He placed his fingers on the keys, took a deep breath and began to play. The first few notes came out uneven, his nerves getting the better of him. He made a small mistake, barely noticeable, but it felt huge to him. A soft snicker came from somewhere in the room. He swallowed hard and kept going. For a few moments, it seemed like the entire hall was watching him fail. But then he remembered the nights in the cafe, the quiet sound of rain outside, the flicker of the neon sign through the window, the way music had always made him forget everything else. He closed his eyes and let the world around him fade away. The laughter, the fear, the pressure, all disappeared. His fingers began to move differently now, no longer afraid, no longer uncertain. The melody started to flow naturally, like water finding its path. Each note carried emotion and soft, trembling, but full of heart. The judges leaned forward slightly, their pens pausing midair. The director's eyes narrowed, not in disapproval, but in quiet curiosity. He lost himself in the music. It wasn't about impressing anyone anymore. It was about telling his story through the only language he truly knew, the piano. The melody grew stronger, deeper, filled with pain, hope, and memories that words could never express. He didn't notice the audience falling silent, or the students who had mocked him earlier now sitting still, their faces slowly changing. As the final note lingered in the air, he lifted his hands and opened his eyes. The room was quiet. For a second, he thought he had done something wrong. The silence felt heavy, almost unbearable. He stood up slowly, unsure of what to do. Then the director spoke, his voice calm but clear. "Thank you," he said simply. No expression, no hint of what he thought. Just those two words. The young man nodded, gathered his sheets, and bowed again. He turned to leave, his heart pounding in his chest. As he walked toward the door, he heard a faint murmur behind him. Not laughter this time, but something softer. Whispered words of surprise, maybe even respect. Outside, he exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. His hands were still shaking, but his chest felt lighter. He didn't know if he had impressed anyone, and honestly, he didn't care anymore. For the first time, he had played not out of fear, but out of love for the music itself. He sat down on a bench in the hallway, staring at his calloused fingers. They weren't smooth or graceful like those of trained pianists, but they had created something real. He smiled faintly to himself, remembering how he used to watch the cafe's customers tap their fingers on the tables while he swept the floor. Back then, he had dreamed of playing on a real stage someday. Today, he had done it. Behind the closed doors, the director remained seated, staring at the piano. He didn't say a word, but there was something thoughtful in his expression. The other judges exchanged quiet looks, whispering about the unexpected performance they had just witnessed. There had been mistakes, yes, but there had also been something rare, something deeply human in the way those notes were played. As the young man stood to leave the building, he glanced one last time at the audition room. The laughter, the whispers, the judgment, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was that he had walked in afraid and walked out free. He stepped into the sunlight, the city noises rushing around him, but for once his heart was calm. The audition was over. Whether he passed or failed, he knew one thing for sure. He had left a piece of himself on that piano. And that in itself was enough. The street outside the academy was filled with noise. Cars honking, people rushing by, the wind brushing past his face. But he hardly noticed any of it. His mind was still inside that hall, with the sound of the piano echoing in his ears. Every step he took felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because the performance was over, heavier because he didn't know what it meant. He stopped at a small tea stall on the corner of the street. The man behind the counter poured him a cup without asking, as if he could tell the boy had come from a long day. He sat on a wooden bench, his music folder beside him, and stared at the steam rising from the cup. His heart was still racing. He tried to replay the performance in his head, every mistake, every right note, every breath he took. He wondered what the judges were thinking. Maybe they saw him as someone who didn't belong there. Maybe they would laugh about him later. The boy who showed up in a worn-out jacket with shaky hands. But then again, maybe one of them had listened, really listened. That small hope was enough to keep him from feeling completely defeated. When he finally reached the small room he rented near the railway station, the sun was already setting. It wasn't much, just a bed, a wooden table, and a broken fan that made a clicking sound every few seconds. He placed his music folder on the table and sat down. For a while he just stared at the wall. The silence was comforting after the noise of the day. He closed his eyes and remembered his mother again. She had always believed in him, even when no one else did. He could almost hear her voice saying, "Don't worry about what others think. Just keep going." A faint smile appeared on his face. No matter what happened tomorrow, he knew he had given his best. The next few days passed slowly. Each morning he went to the cafe to work his shift. He wiped tables, served tea, and listened to the customers' laughter. The piano stood quietly in the corner, gathering dust. Every night after the cafe closed, he would sit there again, pressing a few keys softly, letting the music fill the empty room. It was the only time he didn't feel invisible. A week later, the results of the audition were announced. He wasn't expecting anything, maybe a polite rejection letter at most. But when he went to the academy notice board that morning, he stood frozen. His name was there. Not only had he passed the first round, but he was also invited to perform again in front of the academy's director for a special review. He couldn't believe it. His hands trembled as he read the list again and again. Some students nearby noticed his reaction and turned to look. One of them recognized him and whispered, "That's the same guy from last week." The others glanced at him with disbelief. A few even laughed quietly, thinking it must have been a mistake. But the paper on the wall didn't lie. He stepped back, his heart pounding harder than ever. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of something he hadn't dared to feel: pride. Not the loud kind that boasts, but the quiet kind that makes you want to cry and smile at the same time. That evening, he went straight to the cafe and sat at the piano. The owner, an older man who had known him since he started working there, walked over and asked, "Something good happened?" He nodded slowly, trying to find the right words. "They called me back," he said softly. The man smiled, clapped him on the shoulder, and said, "Then play tonight like you've already made it." He smiled back and began to play. The sound filled the cafe, soft, peaceful, full of warmth. The customers stopped talking for a moment, just listening. He didn't play for an audience or for judges. He played for the feeling inside him, the one that said maybe, just maybe, his dream wasn't so far away after all. The next day he went to the academy again, this time with a little more confidence. But the moment he entered the building, the familiar feeling of nervousness returned. The same group of students from before were there, sitting near the entrance. They saw him and exchanged surprised looks. One of them said with a smirk, "Back again? Must be your lucky day." Another added, "Maybe they needed a sympathy story." They laughed quietly, pretending not to look directly at him. He didn't reply. He simply nodded politely and walked past them. Their words still hurt, but not as deeply as before. Something inside him had changed. He had started to realize that people's laughter didn't define his worth. His music did. When he entered the audition room, the atmosphere was different this time. Only the director sat there, along with two other senior professors. The hall felt quieter, more serious. The director looked at him for a long moment and then said, "You surprised many people last week." His voice was calm, but there was something thoughtful in his tone. The boy bowed slightly and said, "Thank you, sir." The director nodded. "Today I want to hear something from your heart," he said. "Not just from your fingers." The words made him pause. He understood exactly what the director meant. It wasn't about perfection. It was about truth. He sat at the piano again, took a deep breath, and began to play. Not the same piece as before, but a new one he had been working on in secret. It was a piece he had never shown anyone, one that carried all his memories, struggles, and hopes. The melody started softly, almost like a whisper. As it grew, it painted pictures of his childhood, the dusty roads of his village, the nights he sat outside listening to crickets, the old piano at the cafe. The director listened intently, his expression unreadable. The professors exchanged quick glances but said nothing. The music grew stronger, filled with emotion. Every note seemed to speak words he couldn't say out loud. By the time he reached the end, the room was silent. He lifted his hands from the keys slowly, the sound fading into stillness. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the director leaned forward slightly and said, "Who taught you to play like that?" His voice was softer now, not formal like before. The boy hesitated, unsure what to say. "No one," he replied quietly. "I just listened and learned." The director sat back in his chair, studying him. The silence stretched between them. Then the director said, "You have something rare. Technique can be taught, but what you have, That feeling, that's something you're born with. His words hit the boy's heart like a wave. He didn't know what to say. He only bowed again, his eyes wet with emotion. The director looked at the other professors and said, "I think we should see more of him." They nodded in agreement. "Prepare for the final showcase next month," the director said. "You'll be performing in front of our full panel and the city's orchestra members." The boy froze. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. The final showcase was something only the top students were invited to, the kind of opportunity that could change a person's future overnight. He nodded, barely managing to whisper, "Thank you, sir." When he left the room, the hallway felt brighter than before. The air seemed lighter. For the first time, the laughter and whispers around him didn't matter. He had been seen, really seen. Not as the poor boy who didn't belong, but as a musician with something worth hearing. That night, he walked back to his small room with a quiet smile. The city lights reflected on the wet streets after a light rain. He didn't take the bus or a taxi. He just walked, his heart full. Every step reminded him of how far he had come. From the cafe corners to the academy's grand hall. When he reached home, he sat by the window, watching the lights outside fade slowly into darkness. He thought about all the people who had laughed at him, all the nights he had played alone, all the times he wanted to give up. Every one of those moments had brought him here. He whispered softly to himself, "It's only the beginning." He didn't know what the future would hold. There would still be challenges, still be people who doubted him, but deep down he knew one thing for sure. Music had given him a voice, and for the first time in his life, the world was finally listening. The night after the director's words, he couldn't sleep. The rain tapped softly against the window, and the sound reminded him of the rhythm of piano keys. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had brought him here. It all seemed like a dream. The audition, the director's praise, the invitation to the final showcase. But behind that dream were years of struggle, silence, and music that no one had heard but him. He had grown up in a small town far from the bright lights of the city. His father had worked as a mechanic in a tiny roadside workshop, while his mother took care of the home and helped neighbors whenever she could. They didn't have much, but their house was filled with warmth and laughter. There was no piano, no fancy instruments, only an old radio that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. As a child, he would sit beside that radio for hours, turning the dial slowly, hoping to catch a tune before the static swallowed it. The music that came through those crackling speakers fascinated him. He didn't understand the language of the songs, but he understood the feeling behind them. He would hum along, tapping his fingers on the wooden table, trying to copy the rhythm. When he was around 10, he heard a piano piece for the first time. It was faint through the radio on a quiet evening. The sound was different, smooth, gentle, like a story told without words. He didn't even know what the instrument was called at that time. He only knew it made him feel something deep inside, something peaceful and beautiful. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about it. From that day on, he began to dream of one day playing those same sounds himself. But dreams cost money, and his family barely had enough for food and rent. When he turned 16, his father fell ill and couldn't work anymore. To help, he left school and started doing small jobs, cleaning shops, delivering packages, carrying boxes in markets. The days were long, but the nights were his own. Whenever he passed by a music shop or a cafe that had a piano, he would stop outside the window and listen. There was one cafe near the bus station that played live music every evening. Through the open door, he could see the musicians inside, confident, well-dressed people who made the keys dance effortlessly. He used to stand outside for hours, listening quietly, sometimes pretending to wipe his hands with a cloth so no one would tell him to leave. The manager noticed him a few times but never said anything. One evening, the pianist didn't show up and the cafe was quiet. The manager saw him standing outside again and suddenly called out, "You there? Do you want to work here?" The question surprised him. "Yes," he said quickly, even though he didn't know what kind of work it would be. That's how he started working as a cleaner at the cafe. It wasn't much, but it meant he could stay close to the piano. Every night after everyone had left, he would sweep the floor, clean the tables, and then stand beside that piano. At first, he only dared to touch it lightly. One key, then another. The sound filled the empty room, echoing softly through the silence. It was magical. The first time he pressed a full chord, it felt like the room had come alive. He didn't know the notes or the scales, but he could feel the music in his heart. He began to teach himself slowly. He watched the musicians who played in the evenings, memorized their movements, and repeated them later when he was alone. He noticed how their hands moved, when they pressed hard, when they played soft, when they paused to breathe. Every night he practiced until the sky began to lighten. Sometimes his fingers hurt so badly that he could barely move them, but he never stopped. He didn't have sheet music, so he started creating his own. He drew lines on old paper and marked them with symbols that only he understood. Each note represented a sound he remembered. Over time, those pieces of paper became his most valuable treasure. That was how he composed his first melody, one that carried the sound of quiet nights, the hum of the city, and the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The cafe owner eventually noticed. One morning, when he came early to open the doors, he found the boy sitting at the piano, playing softly with his eyes closed. The man didn't say anything. He just stood by the door listening. When the music stopped, the boy looked up, frightened, thinking he was in trouble. But the man smiled and said, "If you're going to play, play with the lights on." From that day forward, he didn't hide anymore. Whenever the cafe closed, he played freely. Some customers began to notice too. A few of them stayed late just to hear him practice. They didn't know his name, but they liked the sound of his music. Once, an old man left a small note on the piano before leaving. It said, "Keep playing. The world needs your sound." He kept that note folded in his pocket for years. Still, life wasn't easy. Some nights he went to bed hungry. Some weeks he couldn't afford rent and slept in the cafe's storeroom with his old jacket as a blanket. Yet, no matter how hard things got, he always found his way back to the piano. It became his only friend, the one thing that never turned away from him. When his mother passed away, he played all night long. Every note carried his tears, his love, his pain. The music was all he had to keep her memory alive. That night, he wrote a piece that he never shared with anyone, not even the cafe owner. It was the same piece he played at the first audition, the one that silenced the hall. As the memory of those years filled his mind, he sat by the window of his small room in the city, lost in thought. He realized that every moment of struggle had shaped him into the person he was now. Every laugh, every sleepless night, every time someone told him he couldn't make it, all of it had pushed him closer to his dream. He took out his music folder from the table and opened it carefully. The pages were wrinkled and covered in pencil marks. Some of them were torn at the edges, but each one told a part of his journey. He smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "These are my stories." The final showcase was only a few weeks away now. He knew the competition would be tougher than ever. The best students from the academy would perform, many of them trained for years under top instructors. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He didn't need to prove he was better than anyone. He just wanted to play honestly, to share the truth of his music. Every evening after his cafe shift, he practiced for hours. Sometimes he played the same passage over and over until it felt just right. The cafe owner often watched him quietly, occasionally bringing him tea without saying a word. The two didn't talk much, but there was a silent understanding between them. One man offering support, the other chasing a dream. One night, as he played softly, the cafe owner said from behind the counter, "You know, when you play, people stop talking. Even the noise outside seems to listen." The boy looked up surprised and the man smiled. "That's a gift," he said. "Don't waste it." Those words stayed with him for days. As the day of the final performance drew closer, he started feeling nervous again. The thought of standing in front of a huge audience made his heart race. But whenever fear crept in, he reminded himself of the boy he once was, standing outside a cafe door, listening to the music he couldn't yet play. That memory gave him courage. One evening, as he walked home under the city lights, he stopped by a street musician playing a violin. The man's clothes were old, but his music was beautiful. A small crowd had gathered around him. The boy stood there listening for a long time, smiling to himself. When the music stopped, he dropped a few coins into the man's box. The musician nodded gratefully and said, "It's not about how many listen, it's about how deeply they feel." Those words felt like an echo of his own heart. That night he sat down at his piano and played the same melody again, the one that had changed everything. The sound filled the room, flowing gently like water. His fingers moved with confidence now, his heart steady. The music wasn't just notes anymore. It was his life written in sound. When he finished, he sat quietly for a long time, his hands resting on the keys. The world outside was silent, but inside him everything was alive. He knew now that no matter what happened at the final showcase, whether he won or not, he had already found what he was looking for. His dream was not just about fame or recognition. It was about being able to speak through his music, and knowing that somewhere someone would listen and understand. He looked at the piano one last time before turning off the lights. The journey ahead was uncertain, but his heart was ready. The boy who once listened outside a cafe door was now ready to play for the world. The morning of the final showcase arrived quietly. The city was just waking up, but his heart had been awake all night. He hadn't slept at all. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the piano under the bright lights, the faces of the audience, and the silent stare of the director waiting for him to play. He got up early and went for a walk before the sun rose. The streets were still empty and the air felt cool and calm. He stopped by a small bakery and bought a piece of bread with the few coins he had. As he ate, he looked at the rising sun and whispered softly to himself, "This is it." That single thought filled his chest with both fear and hope. He knew this day could change his life forever, or end the dream he had carried for years. But deep down, he reminded himself of one thing his mother had always said: if you give your heart, the result will take care of itself. When he reached the academy, the main hall was already busy. Contestants were arriving, some chatting, some rehearsing quietly in corners. He saw the same group of students who had mocked him before. They were standing near the door, dressed in perfect suits, their hair neatly done. One of them looked at him, raised an eyebrow, and whispered something to his friend. The others laughed softly. He didn't respond. He just walked past them calmly, holding his worn-out folder close to his chest. His clothes were simple as always, the same jacket, the same shoes. But this time he carried something they didn't: peace. He went inside the large hall where the final showcase would take place. The stage looked even bigger than he remembered. A beautiful grand piano stood in the center, polished to shine under the bright white lights. Rows of chairs filled the space, and guests were already arriving: professors, directors, musicians, even members of the city orchestra. The air buzzed with nervous excitement. He sat in the back row waiting for his turn. One by one, the contestants performed. Their pieces were perfect, smooth, technical, fast. The audience clapped politely after each performance. The judges took notes, their faces calm and unreadable. As he watched, he felt a wave of doubt again. Every performer looked so confident, their music so precise. He looked down at his hands. Rough, a little calloused, the hands of someone who had worked more than practiced. He closed his eyes and whispered quietly, "Just play from your heart. That's enough." After nearly 2 hours, his name was called. The sound of it echoed through the hall. He took a deep breath and stood up. His legs felt weak for a moment, but he steadied himself. As he walked to the stage, he could feel hundreds of eyes following him. The whispers began, soft but clear. "Is that the same boy from the audition?" someone said. "I heard he's self-taught," another voice replied. "He doesn't even have proper training." He ignored it all. He climbed the small steps to the stage, bowed politely to the judges, and sat down at the piano. The lights above him felt warm, almost blinding. His reflection shimmered faintly on the black surface of the instrument. For a moment, he just sat there quietly, his hands resting on his lap. The hall was completely still. Even the whispers stopped. The director, seated in the middle of the panel, watched him with a calm, serious expression. He placed his fingers on the keys. The first touch always felt sacred, like greeting an old friend. He closed his eyes and began to play. The opening notes were soft, gentle, almost like a whisper. The sound floated across the hall, touching every corner. The melody started slow, carrying a kind of sadness, like a memory returning after a long time. People who had been leaning back in their chairs began to sit up. The quiet chatter stopped completely. The boy played with his eyes closed, his face calm but full of emotion. He wasn't thinking about the audience or the judges anymore. In his mind, he was back in the cafe, the smell of tea, the soft clinking of cups, the silence of midnight. He remembered his mother's face, the old radio. The nights he sat outside the music shop dreaming of a sound he couldn't afford to make. The melody began to change. It grew stronger, deeper, rising with quiet power. His fingers moved faster now. his whole body flowing with the rhythm. The sound told a story and of hunger, of loneliness, of hope that never gave up. The audience watched in silence, completely still. The director leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the piano. One of the professors lowered his pen slowly, forgetting to take notes. Even the group of students who had mocked him earlier sat frozen, unable to look away. There was something raw in the way he played, something real. It wasn't polished or trained. It was pure emotion, straight from the soul. Each note seemed to speak a word. Each pause felt like a breath. And the music wrapped around everyone like a living thing. When he reached the middle of the piece, his hands began to tremble slightly, but he didn't stop. He leaned closer to the keys, his eyes still shut, his lips moving silently as if he were speaking to the piano. The melody turned softer again, like a whisper after a storm, fragile but full of peace. People could feel it, the story hidden behind the notes. Some could almost see it in their minds. A boy cleaning tables at night, staying awake just to play a few keys, dreaming of a stage like this one. As the music built toward its end, he opened his eyes. For a brief second, he looked at the piano as if saying goodbye. His fingers pressed the final notes gently, letting them fade slowly into silence. The last sound lingered in the air like a heartbeat. Then nothing. Absolute stillness. He kept his hands on the piano for a moment longer, breathing slowly. The hall remained silent. No one moved. He looked up, confused for a moment, unsure if he had done well or failed completely. Then slowly the director stood. It was such a simple motion, but in that quiet room it felt powerful. The rest of the panel turned toward him. The director's eyes were slightly wet, though his face stayed calm. He said softly, "That was not just playing. That was truth." The words echoed in the hall. Then came the applause. Not sudden or loud at first, but slow, growing stronger, filling the entire space. People stood up one after another, clapping, cheering. Some had tears in their eyes. He sat there, stunned, unable to move. His heart was beating so fast he could hardly breathe. The noise felt distant, almost unreal. He finally stood up, bowed deeply, and whispered a quiet, "Thank you." As he stepped off the stage, the same students who had laughed at him before now looked at him in silence. One of them lowered his eyes, embarrassed. Another clapped quietly as he passed. He walked out of the hall, still hearing the echoes of applause behind him. Outside, the sunlight hit his face, warm and soft. He sat down on the steps for a moment, letting out a shaky breath. His hands still trembled, but not from fear, from relief, from disbelief, from joy. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he had won or not. But in his heart, he already knew the truth. Something inside him had changed forever. A few minutes later, the director came out through the main doors. He looked at the boy sitting quietly and smiled gently. "You made everyone listen," he said. "Not to your notes and to your heart." The boy stood up, unsure how to respond. The director continued, "Whatever happens now, never lose that. Technique will follow, but feeling is rare." He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and added softly, "You have a gift. Don't hide it again." When the director walked away, the boy stood there alone, staring at the academy building. The same building that had once made him feel small now looked different, not as a wall between him and his dream, but as a door he had finally walked through. That evening, he returned to the cafe as usual. The owner smiled when he saw him. "You did it, didn't you?" the man asked. The boy laughed softly and said, "I think so." The cafe was quiet that night, only a few customers at the tables. He sat down at the piano and began to play, not for judges, not for applause, but for himself. The melody was gentle and full of peace. Outside, people walking by stopped to listen through the open door. The city lights reflected softly through the window, and the sound of his music floated into the night air. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing the dream anymore. He was living it. The next morning, he woke up earlier than usual. The sunlight slipped through the small window of his room, lighting up the walls where a few old posters of pianos and musical notes still hung. For a moment, he just lay there, listening to the quiet sound of the city waking up outside. He still couldn't believe what had happened the day before. The sound of applause, the words of the director, the way people had stood up for him, it all felt like a dream. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, and smiled to himself. For once, his heart didn't feel heavy. When he reached the cafe, the owner was already cleaning the counter. He looked up and grinned. "The boy who made the whole academy stand up," he said proudly. "The news has already spread." "The news?" he asked, surprised. "Yes," the man replied, wiping his hands on a towel. "Someone recorded your performance on their phone. It's all over social media now. People are calling you the self-taught pianist who silenced the judges." He froze for a moment, not sure how to react. He didn't even know people were recording. The owner laughed softly at his expression. "You're famous, my boy. Come sit down, I'll make you some breakfast. You need it more than ever." As he ate, the cafe's old television played a local morning show. And then suddenly his face appeared on the screen. It was a short clip. Him sitting at the piano, the hall in complete silence, and then that final note echoing through the air. The host's voice said, "This young man's heartfelt performance has gone viral overnight, touching thousands across the country." He just sat there, spoon frozen halfway to his mouth, staring at the screen. The cafe owner laughed again and said, "Looks like the world finally heard what you've been trying to say through your music." Later that day, he went back to the academy to collect his feedback sheet from the judges. The hall was quiet now, empty after the grand event. He walked slowly through the same corridor where he had once been laughed at. This time, no one whispered or pointed. Some students nodded politely when they saw him. Others smiled with quiet respect. He knocked gently on the director's office door. "Come in," a calm voice said from inside. The director was sitting behind a wooden desk reading some papers. When he saw the boy, he smiled warmly. "I was hoping you'd come today," he said. "Please sit." The boy sat down nervously. The director placed a folder on the desk and said, "We reviewed the results this morning. You didn't just pass, you earned the highest score of the evening." The words hit him like a wave. He blinked, unsure if he heard right. "Highest?" he repeated quietly. The director nodded. "Yes, and not because of perfect technique or training. You gave us something that cannot be taught feeling." He didn't know what to say. His throat tightened a little as the director continued. "We want to offer you a scholarship here at the academy. Full support for your training. You deserve the chance to grow with proper guidance." For a moment, the boy couldn't speak. All the years of struggle, all the nights of playing alone, every moment of doubt, it all came rushing back. He lowered his head, trying to hide the tears that suddenly filled his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered finally. The director smiled and said softly, "No, thank you. You reminded all of us why music exists in the first place." After leaving the office, he stood outside the academy for a long time. The air felt fresh and new. He looked up at the tall building, the same one that had once seemed impossible to enter. Now it stood before him, not as a wall but as an open door. That evening, when he returned to the cafe, the regulars were waiting. The owner announced loudly, "Our boy got a scholarship." Everyone clapped, some even shouted congratulations. He blushed, embarrassed but happy. A few minutes later, a small group of strangers walked in. They looked well-dressed and carried cameras. One of them introduced himself as a reporter from a popular news channel. "We'd like to interview you," the man said kindly. "Your story is inspiring many people." He hesitated at first. "I'm not used to this," he admitted shyly. The reporter smiled. "Just tell us what you feel. That's enough." So he sat down at the piano, answered a few questions, and played a short piece. The cameras recorded as he spoke about his journey, the long nights, the small cafe, the broken piano keys, the people who believed in him. When the segment aired later that night, messages started pouring in from people he had never met. Some wrote, "You gave me hope." Others said, "Your music made me cry." He never imagined that something he loved quietly in his corner of the world could reach so many hearts. Days turned into weeks, and his life began to change slowly. He started attending classes at the academy under the scholarship. The first few days were difficult. Everything felt new, and he often felt out of place among the trained students. But the teachers were kind. They admired his dedication and humility. One afternoon, while he was practicing alone in one of the music rooms, the director stopped by. He listened quietly from the doorway for a while before saying, "Your hands tell a story every time they touch the keys." The boy smiled shyly. "Sometimes I still feel like I don't belong here," he admitted. The director stepped closer and said gently, "Belonging isn't given, it's earned. And you've earned it more than anyone. From that day onward, he worked even harder. He studied music theory, learned new techniques, and practiced for hours every day. Some of the students who had once looked down on him now came to ask for advice. He never held grudges. He simply helped them the same way he had once wished someone had helped him. Months later, the Academy organized a charity concert in the city's largest theater. The director asked him to perform the closing piece. When he heard that, his heart almost stopped. Me? But there are so many better students, he said quickly. The director smiled. Maybe, but none who play from where you do. The night of the concert arrived. The theater was full, every seat taken. Even the cafe owner came, sitting proudly in the front row. The lights dimmed and the stage glowed softly as he walked to the piano. He took a deep breath and began to play. The melody was new, but it carried pieces of his old music. The same feelings, the same heartbeat. The crowd listened silently, and when he finished, the applause was even louder than the one at the Academy showcase. After the performance, people surrounded him backstage, students, teachers, strangers, all congratulating him. One of the guests, a man in a dark suit, introduced himself as a producer from a recording studio. We'd like to talk about recording your music professionally, he said with a smile. The boy was stunned. The producer handed him a card and said, You have something rare. People need to hear it. Later that night, as he walked home under the quiet sky, he thought about how far he had come, from cleaning tables and playing on broken keys to performing in front of hundreds. Yet deep inside he felt the same, just a boy who loved the sound of the piano. When he reached the cafe, it was closed for the night. He used his spare key and stepped inside. The air still carried the familiar smell of coffee and old wood. He sat down at the piano and started playing softly. The tune was peaceful, like a thank you to everything that had brought him here. He thought about his mother again. He wished she could have seen all this, the applause, the scholarship, the lights. But maybe somewhere she had heard it all. A tear rolled down his cheek, but this time it wasn't from sadness. It was from gratitude. As he played, he realized that music had given him everything he ever needed. Not fame, not money, but the ability to speak without words, to touch people's hearts without saying a thing. The night outside was quiet. Only the sound of his music filled the small cafe, dancing gently through the darkness. He smiled, closed his eyes, and kept playing, because for him, the dream was no longer about being known. It was about sharing what had always been inside him. Months turned into a year, and his life changed in ways he could never have imagined. The recording studio that had offered him a chance kept its promise. He recorded his first album, not full of grand classical pieces, but simple melodies born from his heart. They were the same tunes he had played in the cafe, the same ones that had carried him through nights of loneliness and hope. When the album was released, it didn't explode in fame overnight, but slowly people started listening. The music began to spread quietly, just like the first video of his performance had done. People said it felt real, that it reminded them of something they had forgotten: peace, love, memories of simpler days. He never got used to being called famous. Whenever someone said it, he just smiled softly and shook his head. I'm just doing what I love, he would say. The scholarship at the Academy continued, and he kept studying diligently. He didn't let success make him proud. Every morning he still walked to the cafe before class, played a short tune, and shared breakfast with the owner. The cafe had become more popular now, too. People came hoping to hear him play there, but he never charged anyone for it. This place is home, he'd say with a smile. You don't sell music at home. One day the director called him into his office again. There's something I want to show you, he said with a gentle smile. He handed him a letter, an invitation to perform at a national music festival, one of the biggest events in the country. It was to be held in the city's grand concert hall, where the best pianists from around the world were coming to perform. For a few moments, he just stared at the paper. Me, they really want me to play there? He asked, his voice full of disbelief. The director nodded. Yes, you've earned it. This will be your chance to show the world who you are. The days leading up to the festival were filled with practice and preparation, but this time it felt different. He wasn't nervous the way he used to be. He didn't worry about mistakes or judgment. He just wanted to play honestly, like he always did. When the night of the festival arrived, the city was glowing. The grand hall was even bigger than the academy stage, filled with hundreds of people dressed in elegant clothes. Cameras were everywhere, and a quiet buzz filled the room. He sat backstage, his hands folded together, his old jacket still with him. He never replaced it even after all his success, and it reminded him of where he came from. When his name was announced, the applause filled the hall. He walked out calmly, bowed politely, and took his place at the piano. The lights were bright, and for a moment he looked around the hall, rows upon rows of people, faces he didn't know. Yet somehow he didn't feel alone. He placed his fingers on the keys and closed his eyes. The first note he played was soft, like a memory returning. Then another and another. The melody grew, telling his story all over again. The loneliness of his early days, the pain of being mocked, the quiet hope he had clung to, and finally, the peace he had found in his music. Every note carried his journey, the cafe, the academy, the faces that had helped him along the way. The crowd listened in silence, moved not just by the beauty of the music but by the truth in it. Some closed their eyes, others wiped away quiet tears. When the final note faded, the hall was still for a long moment. Then, just like before, the applause came, long, loud, full of emotion. People stood up clapping, cheering. He smiled, bowed again, and walked off the stage. Backstage, the director met him with shining eyes. "You've done it again," he said softly. "You've reminded us what real music feels like." After that night, invitations began to pour in, from orchestras, festivals, and schools. But he never let fame take over his heart. He accepted only a few, the ones where he could connect with people directly. He said no to large tours and advertisements. Music should speak, he told everyone, not sell. He also began to visit small schools in villages and towns. Many of the children there had never seen a real piano before. He brought a small keyboard with him and played for them, telling stories about how he had started with nothing but an old instrument and a big dream. One day, after a small concert at a local school, a little girl came up to him. She looked shy but determined. "Sir," she said softly, "I don't have a piano, but I want to learn. What should I do?" He smiled kindly and said, "You don't need a piano to begin. Just start with what you have. Hum, tap, listen. Music is already inside you. You just need to let it out." The girl nodded seriously, her eyes shining. That moment touched him deeply. He saw himself in her, the same spark, the same hunger to express what words couldn't say. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about the children who wanted to learn but had no means. The next morning, he made a decision. He used a portion of his earnings from the album and performances to start a small foundation, one that provided musical instruments and lessons to underprivileged kids. He called it the Open Keys Project. The project grew quickly. The academy offered support, and musicians from around the city volunteered to teach. Soon, dozens of children were learning music, piano, violin, guitar, and even singing. Watching those kids play brought him a joy deeper than any applause he had ever received. Every time a child learned a new song, every time their eyes lit up with excitement, he felt like he was repaying the world for the kindness he had once been given. Years passed, and his name became well known across the country. People spoke of his humility more than his fame. They said he never forgot where he came from, that even with awards and honors, he still played at the cafe on quiet evenings, still smiled at strangers, still believed that music was about feeling, not fame. One evening, as the sun began to set,
he sat alone in the cafe.
The owner, now older, brought him a cup of tea and said, "You've come a long way, my boy, but you're still the same," he smiled. "I hope I always stay that way." The cafe was quiet except for the faint sound of the street outside. He walked over to the piano, the same old instrument with scratches on the side and keys that had faded from use. He ran his fingers across it lovingly. He began to play again, softly, gently. The tune was new yet somehow familiar. It carried everything he had ever felt: joy, sorrow, gratitude, peace. It was the sound of a journey coming full circle. As he played, a few people passing by stopped to listen. They didn't know who he was. To them, he was just a man playing a piano in a small cafe. But to those who knew his story, he was a reminder that no dream is too small, no beginning too humble. The last note hung in the air for a long time. He looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "Thank you for everything." The owner smiled from behind the counter and said softly, "You always had it in you. You just needed the world to listen." That night as he walked home, the streets glowed with the warm light of the lamps. He passed by the music shop where he had once stood outside, dreaming of the piano he couldn't afford. Now, through the glass, he saw a young boy looking at the instruments with the same longing in his eyes. The boy turned and noticed him. He smiled shyly, and he smiled back. Without a word, he walked inside, spoke to the shopkeeper, and paid for the boy's small keyboard. When the boy looked surprised, he just said, "Don't stop dreaming. One day you'll play for the world." The boy nodded, clutching the keyboard to his chest. As he walked away, he could hear the boy telling his mother excitedly, "He said I can play for the world someday." He looked up at the night sky full of stars and felt peace settle inside him. His life had come full circle, from being the boy who dreamed of playing to the man who helped others dream. And as he reached his small apartment, he sat by the window, gazing out at the city lights. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing the piano. Maybe one of his students, maybe a stranger inspired by his music. He smiled to himself, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Let the music continue." The sound of soft piano notes floated through the night, carrying his story forward, not just as a song, but as a legacy of hope, kindness, and the power of never giving up on a dream.